So he's saying that black can take on b4 to activate the rook. That's definitely how I would look at it. We're activating pieces. It's not about recovering material when we take that pawn. And he said white can get progress on the light squares. So I guess here are the factors. White is active because they have a rook on the 7th rank, and because this bishop is centrally placed and it's attacking some relevant targets. So that's the activity for white. Black's rook, not so active, but they are supporting an advancing pawn, so maybe there's that. This bishop doesn't look so good. It's not that active. In fact, it's nearly trapped. Black's king, safe, but not very active. However, maybe white's king is not that active either. We need to remember that the pawns are pieces as well. This pawn is actually potentially an active one, and this could become active as well. But I think it's also very balanced. I think equal is completely fair. In the game, I took on b4, and I think that it would be super equal after a takes b4. But my opponent played h4. And I played pawn takes a3, pawn takes g5 check, king takes g5. And white played bishop a2. So let's evaluate this position now. Things have changed. Is the evaluation the same? At least one of the important factors, which would be pretty obvious, is that these pawns are now connected pass pawns. That could be a major trump in the endgame. So evaluating a position is sometimes based a little bit on some theoretical understanding or from your experience. So it's good to try to study the Masters games in order to develop a better intuition for how to evaluate positions. Chess is not a pure calculation game. So these connected pass pawns are quite strong. However, white has two pieces. They have a rook and a bishop. They also have their own protected pass pawn. Okay, so Nerf Russians is claiming that white is better because king safety and activity are basically equal, but white has more material. So I guess to understand this position, you have to ask yourself, do these two pawns neutralize this bishop? Maybe not because of that pawn on d4. So let's see how the game went, and maybe we could find a way for white to be better. However, I also think this is pretty equal. So black played rook c6, black's me. And this is a transparent threat, rook c2. How should white deal with the threat of rook c2? Any suggestions? We'll do a little calculation just because it's fun. All right, Atarv is here. Welcome, Atarv. Thanks for your suggestion of bishop b3. However, I think there might be an issue with it. Can anyone see a problem with bishop b3? Yeah, rook c3. I think it should be rook c3. Here, let me play it on the board. After bishop b3, rook c3, the bishop has to move again. And we might have to choose e6 or d5, probably e6. And then what would be the next move for maybe the next couple of moves? The plays become concrete now. All right, Shiniflo saying king g2, but it's black's turn. All right, so he wants to play rook g2, but there's no time. So black would probably play a2, I think. The idea is that after bishop a2, there's rook c2, winning back the piece, and it becomes maybe an unclear rook endgame. I mean, it would become clear if you analyze it more. But definitely during the game, we don't want to make things that unclear as white. And if they play rook a7, I think things become much worse after rook c2, rook c1, and a1 queen. So it looks like there's a lot of potential for counterplay from these pawns, but that doesn't mean that Nerf Russians is wrong. It could be the case still that white is better. But they played king e1, trying to prevent these ideas, and king e1 also is attempting rook f2. So after rook c2, they played rook f2, rook c3. So now the black rook is very active. The white rook is no longer on the 7th rank. The bishop on a2 is a blockading piece. Black's king is active. The queenside pawns are active. It's hard to say that white is actually better. So after king d2, the game quickly ended in a draw. The reason it was a draw is that after b4, attempting to play b3, after d5, they have their own counterplay. If they didn't have the d pawn, probably black's winning. But b3 can't be played without hanging the rook. So, and we also can't play b3 without playing rook d3. But if we play rook d3, they get king c2. So this is why it ended as a repetition draw. Chuniflo might have a suggestion here of rook a7. Chuniflo, is this where you meant to say rook a7? If so, at least the next move is forced, b4. Actually, no. After rook a7, I can win the bishop and protect the pawn. So it's not b4. At least not in this position, but maybe you meant it somewhere else. At any rate, I think the result in the game was pretty fair. It was a standard game, definitely not blitz or something. So let's move on to another position.